Welcome to this presentation on Hanford Village. I want to explore how a community that was close to Bexley was impacted by its closeness to the Bexley community. What we'll look at is how politics and racism literally split an African American community on Columbus's east side. I'm Dr. Scott King Owen. I teach at Bexley High School. Let's begin. If you've ever traveled on I-70 to the east from downtown Columbus, you've probably wondered why the interstate makes such a huge curve, even though it goes pretty straight out of Columbus. And in fact, it's probably best for interstates not to have huge curves, since one, bending is going to create more construction. Two, curves create visibility problems. It'd be better just to go straight. We're going to look at why I-70 does that, and then what it does to this community that sat right here beneath it, a community called Hanford Village. Over on the other side of Hanford Village, we see the Bexley community. So two communities side by side impact each other, but in the end, one of them is going to get torn apart. If you drive to Hanford Village today, you will see some evidence of decay and destruction as a result of the tearing apart of this community by an interstate. But it wasn't always that way, even though Hanford Village had to deal with its share of being sundered throughout its history. 1909 was an important year for Hanford Village because that was the year that it incorporated. At the time, it was much larger than it is today, with boundaries of Main Street to the north, Livingston Avenue to the south, Alum Creek on the east, and Lilly Avenue on the west. At the time, Hanford Village was connected to Bexley's history because Bexley incorporated in 1908. The city of Columbus sued, and as a result, had to defend its annexation in court and eventually won. That inspired lots of other communities nearby to think about the possibility of incorporating as well, taking a page out of Bexley's playbook. After all, Columbus was reaching outwards in all directions, and if these communities didn't incorporate, they would become a part of the greater Columbus project. So, with Hanford Village incorporated, that still did not protect it from the reach of the city of Columbus. In fact, the area from Lilly in the west was annexed, and that took in a number of businesses and a number of other institutions that made Hanford Village much smaller with a smaller tax base. So Columbus's action impoverished Hanford Village. At the time, it was an all-white community, but gradually was being settled by African Americans. In fact, there is an African American mayor, Avery Bowman, in 1913. And Hanford Village would go on to have a number of African Americans in the 1940s, a story I'll tell in just a moment. It remained small thanks to Columbus's annexation. During the 30s, only about 220 residents in the area. So small, impoverished, without a tax base, yet it was trying to be a thriving community and trying to work together to do the improvements that it could do, and in an interracial community at the time. Making it difficult for Hanford Village to get any investment in the 30s was the United States government's designation of certain areas and cities safe for mortgages and safe for investment, and other areas not safe. Real estate agents and those affiliated with them went across the city of Columbus, collected data on communities, and decided which communities would be safe for mortgages, which ones you would be discouraged from investing in. This resulted in a practice called redlining, and you'll see why when I show you a map of it. Areas that were deemed worth investment, the safest, best places to be, were grade A investment places. Grade B places were less value, still worth the investment though, so they were safe. Grade C were declining areas, and grade D were deemed hazardous. People couldn't get loans for grade D areas. They were deemed just unacceptable places to invest in. You're not going to get a return on your investment, so you're not going to get a mortgage to live in these places. So this set up a system that further made places like Hanford Village less prosperous, because Hanford Village was labeled grade D. It would remain poor. It would remain segregated from the rest of Columbus's access to resources and growth. And one of the things that you have to realize about the underlying logic of this grading system was that it was explicitly racist. We have notes from other cities where these maps for redlining were created, and the real estate agents made a big deal of looking at the racial makeup of a community to decide if it was hazardous. With Hanford Village having African Americans and white people living together, it was deemed unacceptable. This is a residential security map, the redlining map, produced by the United States government through the Home Owners Loan Corporation in 1936. And you can see in the middle of the map is Bexley. Bexley is grade A or grade B for most of Bexley, with the exception of the very top part of Bexley. Village of Hanford is right down here. The very tiny village of Hanford is 4th grade. 3rd grade surrounding, 2nd grade not far from that. And in fact, if Hanford hadn't had most of its western section annexed, the area extending all the way to this area right here, it would have remained much more successful economically, and portions of the village would have at least been deemed probably better for investment. But of course, the other thing going against Hanford Village was that it was racially integrated. There were white residents and black residents. And the people who surveyed the areas of cities looked unfavorably upon any kind of integration. They wanted racial homogeneity in districts, because they believed that certain racial groups were better with the upkeep of homes, and that communities were better if they were racially homogeneous. Hanford was suffering from lack of investment dollars, lack of mortgage-backed assistance from the federal government, but it did get some help in the 1930s. The Columbus Urban League helped with city water service to try to provide some infrastructure help for the people of Hanford. They got natural gas by 1936. The Works Progress Administration actually sponsored music classes and sports activities to help Hanford residents get through the Great Depression, especially to help kids. Hanford did organize itself. There was a Hanford Community Club. Much of it was focused around the idea of cleaning up the community, getting rid of debris, getting rid of trash. One of the problems for Hanford that's going to happen again and again is being close to Alum Creek, it is liable to flooding. And there were devastating floods. 1913 was a particularly bad flood. 1959 was a bad flood. Much of the cleanup was in response to white values. That is, the idea that these neighborhoods didn't meet the standards of, say, Bexley next door across Alum Creek. So what was going on for improvement was to try to match the real estate expectations of Hanford's neighbors. Hanford struggled because a large portion of it remained an orchard and actually a dump site. The part closest to Bexley was frequently used for dumping waste and garbage. The same thing happened in the southern portion of Bexley. The area where Ferndale is located was a dump. Owned by a Bexley resident, Minard Holtzman, who burned cars there, and that resulted in the leaching of hazardous chemicals into the grounds. Hanford had a similar story, but in the end of World War II, an investor, real estate developer, and construction company owner got an idea for how to develop Hanford into a new place where homes could be built. This developer was Ivan Gore, and he was backed by government assistance. His plan was to build 150 homes in Hanford specifically for African Americans. So he went into this village, which is already racially diverse, with the idea of adding to the African American population there. His plan was to be able to use the GI Bill as well as government help to build these homes. The problem was always going to be that the GI Bill didn't help African American veterans as much as it helped white ones. Studies have shown that it was harder for Black veterans to get mortgages through the GI Bill, but Gore was optimistic that he could help solve a housing crisis for veterans returning home from the war by building this community. Interestingly enough, a nearby community, Berwick, through the Berwick Civic Association, tried to block the building of these homes. Berwick is across Alum Creek and to the south of Hanford Village. And the people of Berwick were in a white restricted community. That is, they had neighborhood restrictive covenants that prevented African Americans and others from buying into Berwick. The fear was having a large community, exclusively African Americans, not far away from where Berwick was located. There is some evidence that Gore was even accused of being a communist. Some Columbus police records show that accusation. And that's because at the time, there was a general assumption that anybody who favored helping African Americans, who favored any kind of what was called race mixing, was definitely leaning towards communism. Though we're going to see in a moment, Gore was a capitalist, thoroughly in his plans. So let's move on and talk about Ivan Homer Gore. Who is this guy and why is he building this project? Gore was born in Michigan, Traverse City, Michigan, where he was educated. He came to Columbus and became a publisher, but quickly left that and got his start in real estate by selling home lots in Upper Arlington in 1918. Upper Arlington was also a restricted community, so only white folks could buy homes there. But that gave Gore his first experience in Columbus real estate, and by all measures, he became successful. He was elected president of the Columbus Real Estate Board in 1935 and was well known and active in real estate circles in Ohio for his numerous building projects. The story for Hanford Village in Gore begins in 1944 with the National Housing Administration allocating resources to Columbus to build 400 homes for Black veterans. Gore owned 27 acres in Hanford Village and saw this as an opportunity. This is an untapped market. See what I mean about him being a capitalist? He faced considerable criticism in Columbus for these plans, not just from Berwick. It's hard to find out exactly who criticized him specifically, since many newspaper accounts kind of papered over that. It just mentions very vaguely. Gore, thoroughly committed to the idea of making money off of this venture, is noted in the Columbus Dispatch with this paragraph, which I think is particularly illustrative of his values. Mr. Gore says the project is the only major residential development in America which was built exclusively for Negro occupancy by private capital for sale to individuals. With him, the development is an economically sound business transaction. To the older villagers and the 43,000 Negro population of the city, it represents a chance to prove to the financial world that they are capable of carrying out a $500,000 obligation to pay for trim, new homes with living space around them. So Gore is thoroughly a capitalist. He is taking a risk, though, and he is going against the vision and plans of many people in the community in terms of what he wants to do here. So there must be something in Gore that perhaps not outright belief in racial equality, but a belief that African Americans could excel if given the opportunity to do so. We can see here the plat map for the creation of this area, the George Washington Carver edition. So you can see this is what Gore is going to build on, extending all the way to just about Alum Creek. The article to the right discusses some of the criticism, particularly led by the Berwick Civic Association, led by Henry Moss, who said he intended to send a letter to the Federal Housing Authority asking it to conduct a thorough investigation of Mr. Gore. Mr. Moss said the real estate men had taken an option on 20 acres of vacant land in Hanford Village. He said the project would consist of 150 brick dwellings, would be directed just south of the present buildup. So there's definite racial bias, according to this article, with a fear by these folks in Berwick of having Black neighbors. I couldn't find any evidence of any animosity from the Bexley side of the question. It doesn't show up in newspapers. But possibly that could have also existed from some folks. So here's a picture of the houses that they were building in Hanford Village. They're small in size. They're meant to be within the reach of veterans, people of more modest means. And they're designed to fit two considerations. One, the need for housing after World War II, which was a huge problem in America after the war was over. And because of that need, the second consideration was that these houses were necessarily small. They're going to be identical because that means you can quickly put them together. In many ways, it would not be unlike other housing developments in post-war America, which focused on almost an assembly line process for small homes aimed directly to veterans. Gore ended up building 146 Cape Cod style homes in this George Washington Carver addition to Hanford Village. This is very similar to projects you would see in Levittown. Prices a little bit less than Levittown. $6,500 for purchasing one of these homes. $125 down, $42.88 a month for 20 years, which is offering the promise of home ownership to people who, in the wake of the Great Depression and the destruction of World War II, are eager to settle down and build lives. Veterans could skip the down payment, which this is pretty typical for projects aimed at veterans. And the Federal Housing Administration would loan money to help buyers, which was not always successful in other places, but it was more successful because Gore had been working through the federal government at this point. In fact, the United States government praised Hanford Village as a success in its reports on the building of homes for veterans, even though Columbus residents weren't particularly too happy about the village. And we're going to explain why momentarily. Here is a 1946 ad for buying one of these homes being built in Hanford Village. The Veterans Administration requires that we offer these homes to honorably discharged veterans first. They're ready for occupancy. They're new, modern homes. Just go and see one. I found it interesting that when you look at Black newspapers, the ads do not mention race. But when you look at the Columbus Dispatch, the largest newspaper in town, the ads were very specific about the targeted audience. So notice here that it specifically identifies who they are looking for under the GI Bill of Rights for $125 cash and $42.88 per month. In many ways, Gore promoted an economic boom for Hanford Village. In 1946, they had just 230 residents, but the expectation was that the bringing in of these 146 houses would at least double the population. And it would also dramatically increase the tax valuation of the property. The village estimated that their tax valuation would go from about $131,460 to over $600,000 with the addition of these new houses. And that new tax base would then help Hanford Village foster all the kinds of developments that it wanted to do but couldn't without the money from taxes. The village clerk, Miss Arites Thomas, who'd been clerk for something like 20 years at this point, said that the villagers were actually proud of the development. It instilled added pride, and it encouraged many of the people already living there to fix up their own properties. So the bringing in of these African-American veterans was not seen as a problem to the people already living in Hanford Village. They welcomed this chance for the village to grow. So predictably, war veterans were among most of the residents in this new George Washington Carver section, particularly a lot of Tuskegee Airmen were in the village. Tuskegee Airmen were really not welcome overall in Columbus because they had a history of challenging segregation, as many post-war African American soldiers did, because they said, we didn't go fight Nazis just to come home and deal with the Alabama version of, of, of those racists. And so many African Americans were actively challenging their mistreatment, actively challenging Jim Crow standards and expectations. We do know that these African American residents did run into discrimination in local restaurants, they were not welcome in many places to eat locally, and a lot of folks just didn't want these outside agitators, as they're sometimes called, as neighbors. By 1950, the village had 922 residents. They'd gone from 230 to 922. It's a dramatic increase. And then Columbus comes in again and causes some difficulty when it annexes the village in 1955. 167 people in the village petitioned to be annexed to Columbus. And that started an annexation fight that dragged on through the local and the state courts until 1959. The people who were in the village wanting to be annexed wanted to take advantage of city services like fire and police protection. The people opposing the annexation were the mayor and the council of Hanford Village. But they lost their challenge and then became part of Columbus. Here is the 1942 City Council. You can see lots of African American faces here. Mayor Fred Clay in the back at the desk. Marshall Beatty next to him. All the council members, Jesse Holloman, Conley Bowman, Walter Thomas, William Holloman, William Robinson, Charles Ward, village clerk. So this is, a community, a small community with African Americans holding prominent positions in leadership of this village. This is their village. And that creates a sense of pride and identity in the village. That was a pride that was only increased by these veterans taking up residence here. The couple here, Irma and Charles Dryden, lived on Clay Court, and you see how excited they are for their new home. And they've got the signs here. Congratulations by the Officers Club. Welcome to your new home, Charlie. And Irma, too. Interestingly enough, the association of Hanford Village with African Americans only increases in this time period, even though it is actually, there are actually white folks living there. This is an MLS real estate card. Carriage Trade Realty donated these cards from their collection from the 50s and 70s, and they listed various properties for sale as a way of, being able to help buyers find properties. So this is 791 Bowman Avenue. Charles Thompson is apparently moving out of state in 1959. And so you can see he's got a 12 by 16 living room, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath. And the second floor is unfinished. That was the design of these Hanford Village houses built by Gore. But look at the bottom in the remarks section. The real estate marketing for Hanford Village was to reinforce segregation by noting, even if this house is to be sold, who should it be marketed towards? But in the distance, was the looming Interstate I-70 project. In the 50s, the planners for I-70 were working through what the future of Columbus would look like. The interstates were being designed and built to make Columbus a modern city. I-70 extending from downtown was already bulldozing its way through Jewish black neighborhoods in a straight line, erasing entire sections of Columbus from the map. But the problem in the design overall was that Bexley was in the way. So the planners looked at the problem and decided Bexley was too expensive. The planning report notes that it was full of large and expensive homes, and there was just no way the I-70 would go through Bexley. They didn't want to deal with the expense. Sure, you could invoke eminent domain and take the property, but Bexley was comparatively wealthier. How long would court battles drag out? How much would it cost the state to do this project, which was slated to be about $9.9 million. So the sacrifice is Hanford Village. It's newer, it's less expensive, and it's populated largely by African Americans. So it would be easier to sacrifice. All of these veterans who bought in 46 and 47 are now looking in 1960 at the possibility of losing their homes. And that's what happened. About 60 of these houses were demolished or moved. One of the residents was so angry about this and so angry about what was happening to his community, he actually burned his house in protest. The houses that weren't torn down were bought by a local company that made a profit off selling them and moving them to other places. What was that profit? What was the price of pain as I-70 came through Hanford Village in 1964 and 65? Well, between $112 and $343. State officer Merle Macklin sold the homes for sealed bids and sold about 40 of them total. One of the local companies that bought up quite a number was C.W. Bryant and Sons. They expected to be able to set them up elsewhere for between $3,000 and $3,500. So they got many of the homes for around $200 each. And then, of course, there'd be costs moving these houses to new locations. Here is a picture from the Columbus Dispatch of the first house. This was 792 Bowman Street, but then moved to Ballman Road, which is east of Reynoldsburg in Licking County. Here's another image of a house being jacked up in order to be moved. Here is the home of former Mayor Fred Clay, which was demolished in 1964. And here is a map illustrating exactly what the I-70 project does to Hanford Village. As the curve comes around, you can see that it goes through the top of the George Washington Carver addition. It cuts off the section over here close to Alum Creek from the rest of the section over here, and then runs through these houses, which sundered a neighborhood that had had a history of being annexed and split apart in the past, had been excited and with the prospect of making itself a prosperous place for people to live, only to see that dream being torn away by a city eager to modernize and expand its roadways. So that's the story of Hanford Village and how its relationship with the city and the surrounding communities eventually would cost it its integrity as a place to live.